She didn't say a single word, but the cowboy lowered his gun like he'd just heard a confession no one else could hear. The dust hung in the air, thick and golden under the late afternoon sun, drifting slow between boots and horse legs like the land itself was holding its breath. And right there in the middle of that silence stood a young native woman, her hands empty, her posture still, her dark eyes fixed on one man alone, not the sheriff, not the crowd, not the dozen rifles pointed in her direction, but him, Ethan Cole, a ranch hand who hadn't spoken more than 10 words all morning and now couldn't seem to remember how to speak at all, because something in that look, steady, unflinching, almost calm, cut through the noise in his head like a clean blade. And for a second, just 1 second, the world around him fell quiet in a way that didn't belong to the town or the dust or the people watching. It belonged to memory, the kind that creeps up without asking, the kind that smells like smoke and leather and something older than both, and his fingers, which had been curled tight around the grip of his revolver, loosened before his mind caught up, the metal lowering inch by inch until it pointed harmlessly at the ground, and no one moved. Not the sheriff whose jaw tightened just enough to show doubt. Not the men behind him who shifted their weight like they were waiting for permission to breathe again. And not the woman who didn't step forward or back, didn't plead or explain. Just watched him the same way someone watches a door they already know will open. And Ethan felt it then. That strange pull between strangers. Not trust. Not yet. But recognition. Like hearing a song you don't remember learning. And the wind picked up just enough to brush a strand of her dark hair across her cheek, but she didn't reach to move it, didn't break that line between them. And somewhere behind Ethan, a horse snorted, leather creaked, a man cleared his throat, but it all sounded far away, like it belonged to another place, because right here, right now, there was only that look, and whatever it carried, something heavy, something unspoken, something that made a man lower his weapon without being told, without understanding why, and if anyone had asked him in that moment what he saw in her eyes, he wouldn't have had the words for it, not in English, not in any language he knew, but he would have known it was the truth, the kind that doesn't ask to be believed, only recognized, and somehow, against everything this town had taught him, everything men like him were supposed to see when they looked at someone like her, he understood just enough to hesitate, and out here, hesitation could change everything. 3 hours earlier, the town had not been quiet at all. The wind had been sharper, carrying dust down Main Street in thin, restless lines that curled around porch posts and boots. And the first man who saw her did not speak. He only stopped mid-step and stared like he had found something that did not belong, because she stood just past the water trough at the edge of town, still as a fence post, her clothes marked by travel, her hair dark and loose against her shoulders, and in a place where every stranger was measured before they were welcomed. She measured wrong from the start, a woman alone, native and silent, and it did not take more than a minute for word to spread, not loudly, not at first, just a murmur passed from one man to another, a glance, a nod, the kind of quiet signal that builds faster than shouting, until the sheriff stepped out from his office with that careful walk of a man who already expects trouble, his hand resting near his belt not out of fear, but out of habit, and he stopped about 10 feet from her, close enough to speak without raising his voice, but far enough to keep a line between them that everyone could see, and he asked her name, simple, direct, the way law does when it pretends to be fair, but she did not answer, not because she refused, not because she did not understand, but because whatever she carried inside her seemed heavier than words, and that silence, that small refusal to explain, began to grow teeth in the minds of the people watching, because out here, silence was rarely taken as innocence. It was taken as hiding, and hiding meant guilt, and guilt made men restless. And so they gathered, one by one, boots scraping against dry wood, hands crossing arms, eyes narrowing in ways that had nothing to do with truth, and everything to do with what they already believed. And Ethan had been there from the beginning, standing near the hitching rail with a coil of rope still in his hand, watching without stepping forward, because he had learned a long time ago that towns like this did not need another voice. They needed an outcome. And outcomes came fast once enough people decided they already knew the story, and still, something about her did not fit the shape they were trying to force her into. It was not fear, not defiance, not even anger. It was something quieter, something held close, like a memory wrapped tight in both hands. And only then did Ethan notice the way her fingers stayed closed around something small, hidden against her palm, something she did not show, did not offer, but also did not let go of, and that detail, that one small refusal to release whatever she carried, stayed with him longer than the sheriff's questions or the crowd's shifting tone, because it felt less like concealment and more like protection. And as the circle tightened just a little, as the space between her and the town narrowed without anyone stepping too close, Ethan felt that same strange pull begin again, not strong, not clear, but present, like the first hint of a storm you cannot yet see, only feel in the air, and he did not know then that in a matter of hours, that small hidden object, and the silence wrapped around it, would be the only thing standing between a misunderstanding and something far harder to undo. The sheriff shifted his weight, and the boards beneath his boots gave a slow, dry creak that seemed louder than it should have been, like the whole street was listening for what came next. And when he spoke again, his voice carried that careful patience men use when they are already running out of it, asking her where she came from, asking what she carried, asking questions that were meant to sound simple but pressed harder with each word. And still she said nothing, not a single sound, only that same steady breath rising and falling in her chest. And the longer it went on, the more the silence stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like resistance. Not loud, not aggressive, just present, like a wall you do not see until you walk into it. And the crowd leaned into that feeling the way dry grass leans toward a spark, feeding it, shaping it into something easier to believe. Because it is always easier to believe the worst when no one interrupts you with the truth. And a man near the saloon muttered something under his breath that earned a few quiet nods. Not loud enough to start trouble, but enough to keep it moving forward, and Ethan felt that shift ripple through the street like a change in wind direction, subtle but certain, the kind that tells you something is about to turn whether you want it to or not. And he looked back at her again, not because he had decided anything, not because he felt responsible, but because that small detail from before would not leave him alone. The way her hand stayed closed around whatever she held, and now, standing there with the tension pressing in from all sides, he noticed something else. Something even smaller, the faint tremor in her fingers, not fear exactly, but strain, like holding on to something that mattered more than letting it go. And for the first time he wondered if the silence was not meant for them at all, if it was meant to protect whatever lay hidden in her palm. And that thought sat differently in his chest, heavier, more complicated, because protection is not the same as hiding. And he had seen enough of both to know the difference. And the sheriff took a step closer then, closing half the distance, not threatening, not yet, but enough to draw a sharper line. And the space between them tightened, and for a moment it looked like she might step back, like instinct might pull her away from that pressure. But she did not move. She only lifted her chin just slightly, not in defiance, not in pride, but in something quieter. Something that said she had already made her choice before she ever walked into this town. And Ethan felt that same strange pull again. Stronger now, like a thread being drawn tight between 2 points that had no business being connected, and it made no sense. Not to him, not to anyone watching, because there was nothing shared between them. No history, no words, no reason. And yet there it was, that feeling that something was being said without sound. Something he was not supposed to understand and yet somehow did, or at least enough of it to hesitate, enough to question the story that was forming around her without her permission. And out here hesitation did not last long, not when a crowd was ready to move. And as the sheriff's hand hovered just a little closer to his belt, as the air grew tighter and the dust seemed to hang without falling, Ethan realized that whatever came next would not wait for anyone to figure it out. And that small closed hand, that single hidden thing, might be the only truth that had not yet been spoken. The sheriff's shadow stretched long across the dust as he stopped just a few feet from her, close enough now that the distance between them was no longer about space, but about decision, and his voice lowered, not softer but tighter, the way men speak when they expect to be obeyed, telling her to open her hand. Just that. Nothing more, no accusation, no threat, but the weight behind it settled heavy in the air. And for the first time since she had stepped into town, something shifted in her, not in her posture, not in her gaze, but in the small movement of her fingers, tightening slightly around whatever she held. and Ethan saw it clear as day, that instinctive pull inward, the kind that comes when something matters more than the cost of protecting it. And it struck him then that whatever she carried was not meant for this place, not meant for these eyes. And the thought landed in him with a quiet certainty that did not ask for proof, and the crowd felt it too, though not in the same way. They leaned forward, drawn by that smallest hint of resistance, because resistance gave shape to their suspicion, and suspicion gave them reason, and reason made everything easier to justify. And a man near the front shifted his stance, boots grinding into the dirt, while another crossed his arms tighter, like they were bracing for something they already believed would happen. And still she did not open her hand. She only looked at the sheriff for a brief second, just long enough to acknowledge the demand, and then her eyes moved again, back to Ethan, and this time there was something different in it, something more deliberate, like the first look had been a question and this one was an answer, and it hit him in a way he could not explain, not with logic, not with words, but with memory, faint and distant, like something half-buried rising just enough to be felt, the smell of sage, the sound of a quiet voice beside a fire, a hand pressing something small and cool into another, a gesture without explanation, and his breath, slowed without him meaning it to, his grip on the rope in his hand loosening just like his grip on the gun had earlier, and for a moment the noise of the town slipped again, fading into something dull and far away, because that look, that steady, unbroken line between her and him, carried something that did not belong to this moment alone. It carried weight from somewhere else, somewhere older, and the sheriff took another step, not fast, not harsh, but enough to close the space completely, his hand lifting slightly as if to reach for her wrist, not yet touching, but close enough to make the intention clear. And that was when the air changed, not loud, not sudden, but certain, like the second before rain when everything holds still, and Ethan felt it settle deep in his chest. That quiet understanding forming not from what he knew but from what he recognized, and he realized then that if her hand opened because it was forced, whatever truth it carried would be lost before anyone ever saw it for what it was. And out here, where most things were decided too quickly and understood too late, that kind of loss did not come back around. It just stayed, buried in dust and memory, and without thinking, without planning, he shifted his weight forward just enough to break the stillness. Not stepping fully into the space, not yet, but enough to place himself between what was about to happen and what might never be undone. The movement was small, barely more than a shift of weight and a step no longer than a boot's length, but in a place like this, it was enough to be seen, enough to be questioned, and enough to stop a man's hand from going any further without thinking twice. And the sheriff paused. Not because he had been told to, not because anyone had ordered it, but because Ethan Cole had moved where no one expected him to move, into that narrow space where decisions get made without words, and for a moment no one spoke, the kind of silence that does not come from peace but from uncertainty, and Ethan did not raise his voice or his hands, did not reach for anything or stand taller than he needed to. He simply stood there, angled just enough that the line between the sheriff and the woman no longer ran clean, and that was all it took to slow the moment down, to stretch it just long enough for doubt to find its way in, and the sheriff's eyes shifted toward him, not angry, not yet, but questioning, measuring, trying to understand what had changed, and Ethan felt that gaze but did not answer it, because the answer was not something he could put into words without breaking whatever fragile thing had formed in that space. And behind him, the crowd stirred, not loud, but restless, like wind moving through dry grass, uncertain whether to rise or settle, and someone muttered his name, low and disbelieving, as if saying it might remind him where he stood, but Ethan did not look back, did not acknowledge it, because the only thing that mattered in that moment was the quiet weight of the presence behind him, the woman who had still not moved, who had not taken advantage of the shift, had not stepped away or spoken or tried to change what was happening. She simply remained, her hand still closed, her breath still steady, and that steadiness pressed into him more than any words could have, because it carried no demand, no expectation, only trust placed where it had no reason to exist, and that kind of trust does not come from chance. It comes from something deeper, something remembered, and Ethan felt it settle into place inside him like a piece of a story he had never been told but somehow recognized. and the sheriff cleared his throat then, the sound, sharp in the stillness, and spoke again, this time not to her, but to Ethan, asking him in a voice that carried both authority and restraint if he had something to say, and Ethan took a slow breath, not because he was searching for the right words, but because he understood now that words were not what this moment needed, not many of them, not explanations or arguments, just enough to hold the line that had formed, and he spoke, quiet and steady, the kind of voice that does not push but does not yield either, saying she is not a threat, and nothing more, no story, no defense, just that, and it hung there in the air between them, simple and incomplete, but somehow heavier than all the assumptions that had filled the street minutes before, and the sheriff studied him, long enough for the weight of that statement to settle, long enough for the crowd to feel the shift without fully understanding it, and behind Ethan, the woman's fingers loosened just slightly, not opening, not yet, but enough to ease the tension that had held them tight, and that small change, almost invisible to anyone else, was the closest thing to an answer he was going to get, and somehow it was enough. The words settled into the dust like something heavier than they sounded, simple as they were, and for a moment no one moved to challenge them, not because they agreed, but because they had not expected them, and in a place where most men spoke too quickly, certainty delivered without explanation carried its own kind of weight, and the sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in calculation, measuring Ethan not as a ranch hand now, but as a variable that had shifted the balance, and he took a slow breath before speaking again, his tone careful, asking what made him so sure, and that question lingered longer than it should have, because it was not really meant to be answered, it was meant to be exposed, to show that there was no reason, no proof, nothing solid to stand on, and Ethan knew that anything he said beyond what he already had would only unravel the quiet thread that had brought him here, and so he did not answer right away, not with words, instead he turned his head just slightly, not enough to break the line completely, but enough to see her again, and this time she did something different, something small but undeniable. Her fingers opened, slowly, carefully, like someone unwrapping something that had been held too tightly for too long. And the object in her palm caught the light, not bright, not polished, but worn in a way that spoke of years rather than value. A small silver pendant, no bigger than $1 coin, shaped by hand rather than machine, its surface marked with faint lines that meant nothing to most of the men watching, but everything to the one who saw it clearly, and Ethan felt it before he understood it, that same pull tightening into something sharper, more defined, because the shape, the way the metal curved, the small imperfection near the edge, it was not unfamiliar, it was remembered, and memory does not ask permission. It arrives fully formed, carrying the weight of moments long buried. And suddenly he was not standing in the middle of a dusty street anymore. He was years younger, sitting beside a low fire while his mother held something just like that in her hands, her voice quiet, telling a story about a woman who had found her when no one else would, who had given her something to carry, not as a gift, but as a reminder, and Ethan blinked once, the present returning in a rush of heat and dust, and eyes watching him, and the pendant was still there, resting in her open palm, steady, offered not as defense, not as proof, but as truth placed in the open without demand, and the sheriff glanced at it, then back at Ethan, waiting for something more, something that would make sense of what had just changed. And Ethan finally spoke again, not louder, not stronger, just clearer, saying she is not hiding anything. She is protecting it, and the distinction settled differently in the air. Not everyone understood it, but enough of them felt the shift, that subtle turn from suspicion to hesitation, and behind him, the woman's hand remained open, unmoving, as if the weight of what she carried had finally found the place it was meant to be seen. The pendant rested in her open palm like it had been waiting for this exact moment, not to prove anything, not to defend her, but simply to be seen by the one person who could understand what it carried without explanation, and Ethan's eyes did not leave it, not because it was valuable, but because it was familiar in a way that reached deeper than memory alone, and the longer he looked, the more the past began to take shape around it, not as a clear story, but as fragments that aligned without effort, the way pieces of something long forgotten suddenly remember where they belong. And he stepped closer, not enough to startle, not enough to take control, just enough to see the fine lines etched into the silver, worn smooth in places where fingers had traced them over years. And he recognized the pattern then, not from sight alone, but from the way it felt. In his mind, the same pattern his mother used to draw absent-mindedly in the dirt when she thought no one was watching. The same quiet shape she once told him came from a woman who had nothing to give but still chose to give it. And his breath slowed as that memory settled fully into place, not loud, not dramatic, just certain. And he lifted his gaze from the pendant back to her face. And for the first time since this began, something passed between them that did not feel like tension or question. It felt like recognition shared from both sides, as if the distance between their lives had been crossed long before they ever stood in the same place. And the sheriff noticed it too. Not the meaning, not the memory, but the shift, the way Ethan's stance changed from hesitation to quiet certainty. And it unsettled him in a way he could not quite explain. Because certainty without evidence is difficult to challenge when it does not waver. And he asked again, more firmly now, what that thing was. And this time it was not Ethan who answered. It was her voice low and steady, carrying the weight of someone who speaks only when silence has done all it can, saying it was given to a woman who could not survive the winter alone. And for a moment the words seemed simple, almost too simple, but they settled deeper as they lingered, because they were not meant to explain everything, only enough. And Ethan felt the final piece fall into place, not as a revelation, but as a return. Understanding not just what the pendant was, but why it had been brought here, why it had been held so tightly until now. And he nodded once, small and certain, before turning slightly toward the sheriff, not confrontational, not challenging, just steady, and said she came to return something that was never meant to be kept. And the statement changed the air again, not dramatically, not with force, but with quiet weight, because it offered a different story, one that did not rely on fear or assumption. And the crowd, which had been leaning forward just minutes before, began to ease back in small, almost unnoticeable ways, as if the ground beneath their certainty had shifted just enough to make them reconsider where they stood. And through it all, the pendant remained in her hand, unmoving, no longer hidden, no longer protected, because it had already reached the place it was meant to be seen. And for the first time since she arrived, the silence around her did not feel like something that needed to be broken. It felt like something that had finally been understood. The words did not echo, they did not demand agreement. They simply settled where they were placed. And for a long moment no one tried to move them. Not the sheriff, not the men gathered along the wooden storefronts, not even the wind that had carried dust through the street all afternoon. Because something had shifted in a way that could not be undone with louder voices or stronger opinions. And the sheriff's hand lowered slowly from where it had hovered, not in surrender, but in reconsideration, the kind that comes when a story no longer fits the shape you were ready to believe. And he looked again at the pendant, then at Ethan, and finally at her, as if searching for something that would bring the moment back to something simple, something clear, but it did not come, because clarity had already passed through the space without asking for permission, and the crowd felt it in their own way, not as understanding. Not all of them, but as hesitation, and hesitation is enough to stop a thing that was already moving, and boots that had edged forward earlier now stayed where they were, shoulders that had leaned and eased back just slightly, and the low murmurs that had fed the tension faded into something quieter, less certain, like men unsure if they had spoken too soon. And Ethan remained where he stood, not claiming anything, not pushing further, because he knew this was not a moment to win, it was a moment to hold. And holding it required nothing more than staying exactly where he was, steady, silent, letting what had already been understood do the work that words never could. And beside him, she closed her fingers gently around the pendant again, not hiding it, not pulling it away, but returning it to herself the way someone returns a memory after it has been shared. And there was no urgency in the motion, no fear, only completion, like something that had traveled far had finally reached the place it was meant to arrive. And the sheriff exhaled slowly, the sound barely noticeable, but it carried the weight of a decision that did not need to be spoken aloud. And when he stepped back, just a single step, it was enough to open the space again, enough to release what had been held in tension. And no one followed. No one rushed forward to replace what had just been removed. because the moment had already changed shape, and it would not return to what it was before, and the sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows across the street, stretching them out between people who now stood a little farther apart than they had minutes ago. And in that quiet, in that space no longer pressed tight by suspicion, she turned slightly, not away in haste, not in retreat, but with the calm of someone who no longer needed to stay, and Ethan watched without moving, without calling out, because there was nothing left to ask, nothing left to prove, only that quiet understanding that had passed between them and settled where it needed to be. And as she took her first step away, the dust rose softly beneath her feet, carried by the same wind that had once brought tension into this place, and now carried something else out of it, something lighter, something that did not need a name to be felt. She did not look back right away, and that was the part that stayed with him the longest, not the pendant, not the silence, not even the way the entire town had shifted without a single command, but that simple choice to walk forward without checking if anyone followed, as if she already knew no one would, and the sound of her steps faded slowly into the distance, soft against the packed dirt, until even that was gone, leaving only the quiet stretch of street and the weight of what had just passed through it. And for a few seconds no one spoke, not because they had nothing to say, but because whatever words they had did not seem to belong there anymore. And the sheriff adjusted his stance, glancing once more at Ethan, not with suspicion now, but with something closer to reflection, as if measuring a moment he had not expected to be part of. And then he turned away without comment, his boots carrying him back toward his office, each step steady but slower than before, and the others followed in their own way, not all at once, not in agreement, but in quiet retreat, drifting back to their places along the street. Their conversations lowered, their certainty thinned, and within minutes the town began to move again, the way it always does, as if nothing had happened, but the space where it had happened remained, invisible but present, like a mark left in dust that does not show until the light hits it just right. And Ethan stayed where he was a little longer, his hands empty now, the rope hanging loose at his side, his eyes still resting on the direction she had gone, and the memory of the pendant lingered, not as an object, but as a bridge between something he had known and something he had just come to understand. And he realized then that she had not come to prove anything to the town, not really. She had come to return something to him, something his mother had carried, something that had traveled across years and distance to find its way back without a single word spoken about it. And that was why she had looked at him the way she did, not asking, not hoping, but knowing. And Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind that settles deep, and he turned at last, stepping away from the place where he had stood, not changed in a way anyone else would notice, not marked or named or set apart, but carrying something quieter, something that would not leave him. And as the sun dropped lower behind the buildings and the shadows stretched long across the street, the town returned to its rhythm, steady and familiar. But somewhere beyond the last row of fences, a figure moved along the open land, small against the horizon, carrying nothing now that needed to be hidden. And out here, where most men spoke too much and understood too little, it turned out that the truth had passed between two strangers without a single word, and that was enough.